All right, now let's look at what happens now. Joining us is Chris Garcia, former Deputy Director for the U.S. Department of Commerce under President Trump, and also back with us today, Roger Fisk, Democratic strategist and a former Obama administration official. Roger, I want to start with you. Democrats have taken the House. Congress is a very different picture now. We just heard President Trump in a press conference moments ago saying it's going to be much easier for me now. I'm just going to, if something doesn't work, I'm just going to blame Democrats. Where do Democrats go from here?
Well, I think it was a good night for Democrats. It wasn't a great night. Clearly, there's more work to do in Florida, first and foremost. Texas was always going to be frosting on the cake. That would have been nice. But we did what we needed to do to make it the night that it needed to be. I think these things ultimately are pendulous, and I think the good news that we can take from Florida and some of the other regions is that there's still more groundwork to be done there. I don't think the pendulum has completely swung in the progressive direction yet, and maybe with enough fine-tuning, we can have 2020 be that year before it starts to move back. So good night for Democrats. Not a great night. The president narrowed the playing field for himself to the Senate. And largely held on. The calendar, or the cycle, if you will, was in his favor. There was only one state that the Democrats had to defend a Senate seat in a state where, I'm sorry, there was only one seat that in a state Hillary had won that Republicans had to defend. There were 10 Democratic seats in states that the president had won that had to be defended. So just by the makeup of that cycle, the Senate was going to be a very steep climb. But a good night for the Dems, but not a great night.
Chris, yesterday on this program, you said this election was a referendum on President Trump. We know what he thinks. He called it a vast victory. We just heard from the Democratic strategist saying it was a good night for Democrats. What about you?
Yeah, no, I think the president has basically shrugged this off. I think he's actually very happy with these results. You know, this was far from the blue wave that was promised. This is more of a blue squirt or some kind, you know, blue puddle, whatever you want to call it. But I think what's interesting is that this is democracy at work, and somehow I think the president feels that the underreported story is that we gained significant seats in the Senate. That's what the president really cared about. I think that's what the American people really cared about, is making sure that we have good conservative justices that are appointed to various judgeships throughout the nation. We may see another Supreme Court seat open up in the next couple of years. But also interesting is that all 4 candidates that President Obama campaigned for, lost. And many of the candidates that President Trump campaigned for, were pushed over the edge and actually flipped Senate seats.
Chris, I want to ask you about that. In the president's press conference, there was a lot of talk about former President Barack Obama and a very unusual step of calling out by name Republicans that he supported that did not succeed. What's your take on Trump's approach here, really even splitting the Republican Party, taking credit for any wins and brushing off any losses?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we can run the calculations, we can run the analysis on a seat-by-seat basis, and I think that'd be an interesting study to see. But it looks as though those that embraced President Trump and those that embraced his policies, those that really sided with the president and appeared with him in campaigns, saw a significant bump in their voter turnout, in their base turnout. I think the crowd size was a great indicator of the enthusiasm that you saw with Republicans going to the polls. Definitely the post-Kavanaugh hearing bump as well was something that narrowed that enthusiasm gap. And so I think coming up to Election Day, more Republicans were energized after a President Trump endorsement or after a President Trump appearance in that state.
Roger, I want to have you respond to Chris, but I also want you to address President Trump in that 90 minutes plus press conference did call for some bipartisanship on some issues. He says he could work with infrastructure, prescription drugs. Is that going to be possible with the Democratic House?
One of the lingering mysteries for me for the last year or so has been why, despite having, I don't know, 15 infrastructure weeks, the White House never actually pushed that. I think if they had done so early on, that they probably could have taken advantage of their honeymoon, you know, for the first couple months after being inaugurated. And similar to President Obama getting a stimulus bill through in his first 100 days, the president probably could have done an infrastructure package, but for whatever reason, he didn't want to. There's still other good news tucked in all this narrative. The Democrats picked up 330 state legislative seats, 7 governors, and then there's some very interesting pockets around the country. Kansas, for example, Congressman Yoder losing. Utah voting to expand Medicaid on the same ticket that elected Senator Romney. There's some very, very interesting signals that come from all this. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. The challenge for the president in terms of having any kind of bipartisanship is that there is no policy agenda in the White House. I mean, you could basically watch Fox and Friends in the morning and get a sense of what the president's going to be pushing for and advocating for. There's no coherent policy agenda there. Any kind of traditional Republican agenda is gone. The fiscal conservative pillar of the Republican Party is gone over borrowing $1.5 trillion. The patriotism pillar of the Republican Party is gone due to his subservience to Putin and his behavior in Helsinki. And obviously the family values pillar is gone just by virtue of who he is and what he says and how he's lived his life. So I don't know that he can necessarily advance a Republican agenda. He can probably advance an agenda of his own, which now will shapeshift, and he'll probably adopt infrastructure and some other things because now he has to tack back towards the center when he starts to think about 2020.
Well, Chris, we heard also President Trump in that presser saying this is going to be easier for me because now Democrats are going to be the ones that need to come up with policy and it'll come towards us. So what do you think? What kind of policy do you expect coming out of the White House specifically? Do you think that there are going to be any changes on the agenda?
Yeah, so last night I was actually with some White House Office of Legislative Affairs staff. We were having this very same conversation. Without revealing the contents of our conversation, I think, in a general sense, what President Trump is doing now, and by the way, the reason he didn't go with infrastructure to begin with is because he didn't need to. You know, the economy is so strong, and the difference between the President Trump administration and the Obama administration is that we use sound economic policies, and so when you have full employment, as we do today because of President Trump's pro-growth policies, you don't really need the infrastructure package to put Americans back to work. We can let the economy continue to grow as it is right now. But in terms of the legislative agenda coming up during this House-controlled term, I think the president's very open and willing to work with Democrats, as he said during that 90-minute press conference. If Democrats want to continue pro-growth policies, which would include middle-class tax cuts, that's something he's 100% on board with. And that's good news for all Americans, just as every single thing that he's done has been good news for all Americans.
All right, well, let's jump for a moment to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Let's jump back to that issue of impeachment. That was one question that was brought up both during Trump's press conference and McConnell's. Here's what he had to say about that.
Well, you know, the whole issue of presidential harassment is interesting. I remember when we tried it in the late 90s. We impeached President Clinton. His numbers went up and ours went down, and we underperformed in the next election. So the Democrats in the House will have to decide just how much presidential harassment they think is good strategy.
Roger, a long list of potential probes that Democrats could pursue in the House. Impeachment, is that on the agenda to pursue it?
I would certainly counsel that it is not. There's plenty of things. For example, just last month, the government of China issued 16 trademarks and merchandising licenses for Trump products. Just as in the couple months after he won, both the governments of Russia and China issued trademark licenses to the Trump organization so that they could make more money in those markets. Jared Kushner got $509 million of loans in the course of a couple meetings in the White House. As Chris may know, I don't know what his clearance was, but when I was in the administration, I had top secret clearance for 3 years, and one of the main things they look for is debt, and are you over-leveraged, and are you vulnerable to financial blackmail? And that's why I had higher security clearance than Jared Kushner does. The actions of the governments in Panama and Indonesia around the Trump hotels are completely legitimate avenues of inquiry. So I don't feel a need to get behind the impeachment, you know, kind of narrative, because I don't think that's smart, and I think we should let the process work the way it will. The good thing is that we will remove the clownish behavior of people like Devin Nunes and Trey Gowdy and Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, who will no longer be able to protect the president. And the only person in Washington, D.C. who demonstrates more obedience to Putin than the president is Dana Rohrabacher, who lost. So now the president's the most obedient person in Washington, D.C. to Putin.
I want to pause there, and just before we wrap, Chris, one question, bigger picture, President Trump asked again and again, including just a short while ago, about his tone, about what he says that many view as helping to divide the country. To that, he says, I have no choice. My question to you, if the leader of the world's biggest superpower doesn't have a choice, who does? Do you buy that?
Firstly, the president's got full autonomy in who he is and how he runs the country. He's not beholden to any foreign interests, and you can take that to the bank. If he were a Putin puppet, he'd probably be the worst Putin puppet in the history of the, of anyone in Putin's sphere of influence. We've got more sanctions against the nation of Russia than any previous administration. We've been more aggressive in arming Ukraine, something that President Obama's administration did not do. They sent night goggles. But no, the president's fully autonomous in this, and I think that he's got full ability to execute his agenda. And you know what last night did for us? It guaranteed another 4 years of President Trump.